Before a single tennis ball was struck in anger at the 2026 BNP Paribas Open, before a single match was logged on the iconic Stadium 1 scoreboard, before the California Desert Sun had even properly introduced itself to the tournament grounds on the morning of Thursday, March 5th, 2026. Indian Wells was already on fire, and the name at the center of every conversation, every packed bleacher, every whispered rumor in every VIP hospitality suite from one end of the Indian Wells tennis garden to the other was not Iga Swiatek. It was not Carlos Alcaraz. It was not Coco Gauff or Aryna Sabalenka or any of the players ranked in the top 5 of the world. It was a 20-year-old from the Philippines who had not yet played a single match at this tournament. Her name was Eala. And what happened when she arrived in the California desert was something that this tournament, this legendary 50-year institution, often called the Fifth Grand Slam, had never witnessed in its entire history. What happened was a takeover, a complete, sovereign, documented, jaw-dropping cultural takeover that left the entire tennis establishment standing in the middle of the Indian Wells tennis garden with their mouths open, asking each other one question over and over: who is this girl and why is California stopping for her? Let us set the stage with the real facts first, because the real facts are genuinely extraordinary on their own. The BNP Paribas Open spans 54 acres, features 29 courts, and runs simultaneous men's and women's draws featuring the best players on the planet. On Tuesday, March 4th, just 2 days before Eala's first round match, she held a noon practice session on practice court 6. Nothing unusual about that. Players practice every day at Indian Wells, and on the courts directly adjacent to where Alex was training that Tuesday, 2 of the biggest names in men's tennis were going through their own sessions. Alexander Zverev, a former world number 2 and one of the most popular players on the ATP Tour. Taylor Fritz, a Southern California native, hometown hero, and former Indian Wells champion who draws massive support in this particular desert. 2 genuine superstars, both on the courts right next to Eala. And according to every witness on the grounds that morning, both courts were nearly empty. And practice court 6, Alex's court, was so packed with screaming, flag-waving Filipino fans that some of them had to angle through the fences of the adjacent courts just to catch a glimpse of her. This actually happened. The tournament itself published it, described it in their own official media coverage, called it the Eala effect, and called it real, and called it growing. And this was before she had played a single match. Now, and this is where we enter the realm of the spectacular, the cinematic, the what-if scenario that the Pine Army has been dreaming about since the moment Eala first cracked the WTA Top 100. Imagine that the power of that moment, the raw electricity of hundreds of passionate fans turning a routine practice session into a sovereign spectacle, reached beyond the tennis garden walls. Imagine it traveled up the highway, into the corridors of California's government, and landed on the desk of a man who has always understood that the most powerful currency in American politics is not money, it is a story. And in the spring of 2026, the greatest story in women's tennis, and arguably in all of California sports, was playing out in his state. His name was Gavin Newsom. And in this version of events, this fan fiction celebration of the Queen's arrival in the desert, he decided he was not going to miss it. The motorcade arrived at the Indian Wells Tennis Garden at exactly 11:47 in the morning on Thursday, March 5th, 2026. 6 black SUVs in tight formation, rolling through the player entrance with the kind of purposeful authority that stops people mid-sentence and makes every head turn simultaneously. The main concourse, which had been humming with the comfortable pre-tournament buzz of fans finding their seats and players heading to warm-ups, went eerily, completely still. Tournament security personnel exchanged confused radio calls. WTA officials pressed their earpieces and leaned into doorways, trying to understand what the protocol breach notifications coming through their communication systems actually meant. On the stadium access road, 2 top 10 players, who had been waiting in their courtesy vehicles for clearance to enter the player area, were reportedly told, politely, firmly, with significant apology, that there would be a brief hold on all movement. A brief hold. for a state visit at a tennis tournament. Governor Gavin Newsom stepped out of the lead SUV into the California morning sun with the focused, direct energy of a man who had somewhere specific to be and no intention of being delayed getting there. He bypassed the press entrance entirely. He walked past the media staging area without a glance. His security detail moved with the brisk choreography of people operating on a precise schedule, and the governor himself set the pace, walking with the kind of controlled urgency that told everyone watching, and everyone was watching, that this was not a photo opportunity. This was a mission. The whispers in the concourse ran ahead of him like a current. Who is he here to see? The WTA officials, trailing behind his security detail, were furiously cross-referencing their protocols and finding nothing, because there was no protocol for this. In 50 years of Indian Wells tennis, no sitting governor of California had ever walked onto a player's practice court uninvited and unannounced. It had simply never happened until today. And then he found her. Practice court 6. Alex Eala, in the middle of a baseline drill, her footwork precise and automatic, her focus locked on the ball machine with the tunnel-visioned concentration that players at the Rafa Nadal Academy develop over years of demanding, unforgiving training. The governor's security team stopped at the court perimeter. The tournament officials caught up, slightly breathless, unsure of every procedural step they were about to take. And then, according to the witnesses packed into every available space around that court, fans who had arrived at dawn to claim their spots, some of them flying in from as far as Manila and San Francisco and Vancouver just to watch a practice session, Gavin Newsom did the thing that no sports protocol in the world authorizes, and no power in professional tennis could technically stop. He walked onto the court and waited for the drill to end. The silence that followed was different from the normal silence of concentration at a tennis practice. It was the silence of an entire crowd collectively holding its breath. Alex finished the drill, turned, and saw the governor of California standing on her practice court. And if the witnesses are to be believed, and there were hundreds of them, with hundreds of phones, her reaction was exactly what you would expect from a 20-year-old who has spent years being trained to remain composed under pressure in the most unnerving situations the sport can manufacture. She smiled, she walked over, she shook his hand, and the crowd, which had been absolutely silent for approximately 12 seconds, erupted into the kind of sound that typically only happens when someone wins a championship point at the end of a 5-set match. Now let us pause the fan fiction for just a moment, because something needs to be said about why this imaginary scene lands with such emotional force. It lands because the real story, the actual documented reality of what Alex Eala's arrival meant to the Indian Wells tennis garden is already so extraordinary that the fictional escalation feels almost proportionate. The tournament's own executives were on the record in real interviews, openly celebrating what she represented. Philippe Dor of the BNP Paribas Open told reporters directly that the tournament loved every minute of it, benefited from it, and promoted it. The day-in-the-life video they posted featuring Alex on the Thursday of tournament week, March 5th, the very day our fictional motorcade arrives, became by a massive margin the most watched video on the tournament's entire YouTube channel for the year, with 94,000 views, while the next closest was nowhere near it. The tournament's own Instagram posted their Class of 2026, 9 women representing the faces of this year's event, and it was 7 top 10 players, 1 well-known American, and Alex Eala, not top 20, not top 15, world number 31, because the tournament understood something that the rankings had not yet caught up to, in terms of cultural gravitational pull, in terms of who was moving fans and filling courts, and generating the kind of viral energy that keeps a 50-year-old tournament relevant and exciting and electric. Alex Eala was already operating in a category of her own. So back to our story, back to the practice court, back to the governor. Inside the player lounge, in a private meeting that our fan fiction places at approximately 12:15 in the afternoon, Gavin Newsom reportedly sat across from Alex and her team and laid out a proposal that had been weeks in development, a California-Philippines Youth Development Fund. an elite performance center in the Coachella Valley to be named after Alex, designed to create pathways for Filipino-American youth into competitive tennis. A formal state recognition of what Alex Eala's presence had meant to the 1.7 million Filipino Americans who call California home, the largest concentration of the Filipino diaspora anywhere in the United States. The governor, in this imaginary scene, reportedly said something that felt less like a political talking point and more like a plain, honest acknowledgement of an obvious truth, that what Alex Eala had done in the last 12 months was not just a sports story. It was a community story, a diaspora story, a story about 1.7 million people who had carried their country across an ocean and kept it alive in the California desert, and who had found in this young woman from Quezon City a reason to stand in the cold and the dark and the midnight chill of the desert and scream at the top of their lungs for something that felt like home. The reaction in the locker room, in our imaginary narrative, was predictably divided. The old guard of the tour, the players who had spent years building their brands and their rankings through pure tennis excellence, found the spectacle disorienting. One veteran European seed, according to our fictional locker room sources, was heard saying something to the effect of wondering whether they had arrived at a tennis tournament or a state reception. And honestly, that question, even as fiction, captures something real. Because in the real Indian Wells of March 2026, the boundaries between sports event and cultural phenomenon had genuinely blurred around Alex Eala in a way that tournament officials, WTA executives, and the players themselves were all visibly processing in real time. The scale of the Filipino fan presence was genuinely unprecedented, not just in the stadium during matches, but everywhere, at practice, at the players' lawn, at the food stands. Walking through the fan zones. The flags were everywhere. The yellow and blue and the Philippine sun were everywhere. And the energy they brought to this tournament, the noise, the passion, the sheer love, was something that other players could not help but notice and react to, whether with admiration, bewilderment, or the particular discomfort of someone who has worked extremely hard and still finds themselves in the shadow of something they did not anticipate. In our fan fiction, the governor's departure from the Indian Wells Tennis Garden was accompanied by a brief press statement, just one exchange with a reporter in the parking area, that was anything but brief in its implications. When asked whether the special attention paid to a player ranked 31st in the world at a tournament that featured 10 top 10 players was appropriate or fair, the governor delivered the kind of line that politicians occasionally produce when they are saying exactly what they mean without any spin at all. He reportedly said, "California recognizes greatness when we see it. Alex isn't just a player. She's an inspiration to millions of our residents. Protocol is for the ordinary. Alex is extraordinary." The quote, clean, quotable, unapologetic, ricocheted around the tennis media within minutes of being posted online, generating exactly the kind of debate that Newsom in this fictional scenario would have perfectly anticipated. The WTA establishment was uncomfortable with the framing. Several touring professionals found it pointed, but the 1.7 million Filipino Americans in California, and the 10 million Filipino diaspora members around the world, and the 115 million people in the Philippines who were reading every word of every Indian Wells dispatch at hours of the morning that no reasonable sports schedule should require. They heard that statement, and they felt something that goes beyond a news cycle. They felt seen. Here is what makes all of this, the real story and the imaginary embellishment together, so historically significant. It is not about one governor or one motorcade or one fictional meeting in a player lounge. It is about the documented, verifiable, widely reported reality that a 20-year-old tennis player from the Philippines, ranked 31st in the world, was generating the kind of cultural gravitational pull at one of tennis's most prestigious events that the tournament itself could not stop talking about, could not stop promoting, and could not stop marveling at, even before she had played a single competitive point. The Eala effect, as the BNP Paribas Open called it, was real and growing. Fans who had never watched tennis before in their lives were subscribing to broadcasting packages specifically to watch Alex play. Fans were telling the tournament's own camera crews on record that they pay only when Alex plays. Filipino community members across California were treating Indian Wells the way their parents had treated Manny Pacquiao fights, as a communal event, a national moment of unity and shared pride, something that brought people together across every dividing line and reminded them of where they came from and what they were capable of. Longtime Filipino sports journalist TJ Manotoc, writing in real life for Front Office Sports, captured the emotional temperature of this moment with a line that deserves to be read slowly and fully. The Philippines has been hungry for the next Manny Pacquiao, and when Pacquiao was at his peak, life stopped. Roads emptied, churches became screening rooms, nothing moved except the eyes on the screen. Alex Eala was beginning to move the country in the same way. Not yet at the level of Pacquiao's peak. Grand Slams have not yet been won, world number one has not yet been reached. But the mechanism was the same. One person carrying a flag that 115 million people recognize as their own, competing at the absolute highest level of their sport, refusing to be stopped by fatigue or setbacks or the gap between where they started and where they were going. That is what Manny Pacquiao did with his fists. That is what Alex Eala is doing with a tennis racket. In California, in our fan fiction, through the governor, and in real life, through the tournament officials and the fans and the television cameras and the front page newspaper coverage, California recognized it. The story of Alex Eala's 2026 Indian Wells arrival is ultimately the story of a force of nature meeting an institution that was not built to contain it. The Indian Wells Tennis Garden was built for tennis. It was built for rankings and seedings and protocols and draws and bracket positions and the orderly progression of 64 players through a schedule designed to produce one champion. What it was not built for, what no tennis institution on earth had yet figured out how to contain or categorize or properly account for, was Alex Eala and the entirety of what she represents. The sport, the community, the diaspora, the national pride, the history, the girl from Quezon City who ended up at a tennis academy in Mallorca, Spain, run by one of the greatest champions who ever lived, and who walked onto a court at Indian Wells for the first time in March 2026 and turned the 5th Grand Slam into a Philippine homecoming. The fictional governor's motorcade is a love letter to that reality. It is the fantasy version of what actually happened, which is that protocol did not exactly break, but something very close to protocol broke, which was the assumption that world-class tennis was the main attraction. At Indian Wells in March 2026, the main attraction was a 20-year-old from Manila. She hadn't even played yet, and she was already the story. She was already the queen of the desert. She was already, in every way that actually matters, exactly what Gavin Newsom called her in our imaginary press statement, extraordinary. Now let us talk about what the real Indian Wells establishment actually did, because the truth is almost as cinematic as anything our fan fiction invented. The BNP Paribas Open is a tournament that has operated for 50 years with a clear hierarchy of attention. Grand Slam champions get the biggest courts. Top seeds get the prime scheduling slots. World number ones get the loudest ovations walking through the player tunnel. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. Except in the week of March 1st through March 8th, 2026, something fundamentally disrupted that hierarchy, and the disruption did not come from a corporate sponsor or a television network or a governing body. It came from the fans. It came from the Pine Army. It came from hundreds of Filipino supporters who descended on the Coachella Valley from every corner of California and beyond, turned up at the gates before they opened each morning, and simply refused to be distributed evenly across the tournament's 29 courts, according to any rational schedule. They followed one player, everywhere, and in doing so, they rewrote the practical reality of how attention flowed through this tournament for the entire week. Consider the documented, verifiable scene on Monday, March 3rd. Alex held 2 practice sessions that day, spaced out by an hour lunch break. After the second session ended and she began walking across the players' lawn toward the players' lounge, a large group of fans had gathered at the edge of the lawn, and they began to chant her name. Not politely, not the way tennis fans clap for a player they admire from a respectful distance. They chanted the way fans chant at a stadium concert when the headliner finally walks on stage. Her name, rhythmic and passionate and completely genuine, echoed across the players' lawn of one of the most prestigious tennis facilities in the world on a Monday afternoon before the tournament had even really started. The tournament's own media covered it. They called it, again, the Eala effect. They said it was real and growing. And the growing part was not a metaphor. Every day she was at the tournament, the number of people trying to be in her general vicinity increased. This created practical complications that the tournament had to actively manage, and those complications are the real-life echo of all the fictional protocol-breaking and court shutdown drama we described in our fan fiction narrative. Practice Court 6, the court Alex was assigned to for her early training sessions, had bleacher seating designed for a few dozen spectators at most. By the time her Tuesday noon practice was underway, the seats were completely full and there were fans standing at the perimeter fences, standing on the grass outside the adjacent courts, doing whatever they physically could to get a sightline to the court where she was training. The courts on either side, where Zverev and Fritz were preparing for their own tournament campaigns, had a handful of fans. This was not an insult to Zverev or Fritz. Both are genuine superstars of the sport. It was simply a demonstration of the specific gravitational pull that Alex Eala had developed, and the specific demographic power of 1.7 million Filipino Americans in California who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment for a very long time.